They believed Eugenia Marsh to be nothing more than a companion hired to read aloud and fetch shawls, a woman so plain, so poor, and so entirely without consequence that nobody in Eaton Square troubled to learn how she took her tea. For 11 months she answered to a name that was not hers, copied correspondence in another woman's hand, and watched the family who had stolen her inheritance call itself noble at the very table where her own father once sat. But on the morning a solicitor's brougham finally turned through the gates of Ravensworth House bearing a seal the household recognized before they recognized her, every person who had arranged her humiliation discovered they could no longer lift their eyes from the floor. If you believe a person's worth is not measured by the title before their name, or the cut of their coat, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us which city or country you are watching from tonight. Your presence keeps these quiet stories of justice alive. Now, let us begin. Ravensworth House stood at the eastern corner of Eaton Square, 4 stories of pale Belgravia stucco, with a fanlight over the door and a coat of arms cut into the stone lintel that no visitor was ever permitted to ask about twice. Inside, the rooms still carried the bones of an older grandeur. The cornices molded by craftsmen 2 generations dead, the chandeliers fitted for candles before anyone thought to convert them to gas. The family who lived there now had not built a single one of those rooms, and most mornings Eugenia Marsh thought the house seemed to know it, the way the floorboards complained under feet that did not belong to them. She had been engaged the previous autumn as companion to Mrs. Augusta Ravensworth, a position that paid £22 a year, settled quarterly at £5.10 apiece, and required her to be visible, useful, and silent in roughly that order of priority. The household ran on a strict accounting of who deserved comfort and who did not. On a Tuesday in late September, the breakfast room held a spread that would have fed the kitchen staff for the better part of a week, eggs and kippers and a ham barely touched, toast racks still warm under their covers, a dish of hothouse peaches that had cost, the housekeeper later confided, very nearly 9 shillings the dozen. When the family rose from the table at 9:45, Mrs. Ravensworth glanced at the wreckage of the meal with an expression of faint disgust, as though the food itself had committed some impropriety by remaining uneaten. "Clear it away," she said. The housekeeper, a stout, careful woman named Mrs. Brixton, who had served the house under its previous master, hesitated only a fraction too long. "There is enough here for the servants' hall twice over, ma'am," she said. "It would be no trouble to send it down." Mrs. Ravensworth's eyes moved to her slowly, the way a woman regards an insect that has wandered onto a tablecloth. "I did not ask your opinion of the trouble, Mrs. Brixton. I asked you to clear it away." "Yes, ma'am." The housekeeper's voice did not rise. Her face did not change. But Eugenia, standing near the sideboard with a stack of correspondence she had been sent to fetch, saw the older woman's hands tighten briefly around the edge of a serving tray before she carried it out. Mrs. Ravensworth adjusted the lace at her cuffs, a habit she repeated perhaps 30 times a day, as if checking that her own wealth had not slipped while she wasn't watching. "If we allow servants to grow accustomed to the same table as their betters," she remarked to no one in particular, "they very quickly forget which one they belong to. A house run on sentiment is a house run badly." She said this the way other women remarked on the weather, without heat, without doubt, as settled fact requiring no further defense. By the time the footmen had carried the last of the untouched ham toward the bins behind the scullery, Eugenia had counted, in the 11 months she had lived under that roof, no fewer than 9 occasions on which good food was thrown away rather than sent below stairs. She had also learned, with the particular clarity of a woman who has nothing to lose by noticing, that the household's cruelty was never random. It always traveled downward, and it never once traveled up. That same afternoon she was sent to the small sitting room at the back of the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Ravensworth liked to receive her correspondence and conduct what she called her private business, though Eugenia had come to understand that very little of it was business in any sense a banker would recognize. The room smelled of orange flower water and fresh ink. A maid named Nan was already there, no older than the position she held, kneeling beside an overturned vase that had shattered across the parquet in a fan of blue and white porcelain. "I didn't mean it, ma'am," the girl was saying, her voice unsteady. "I only reached to dust the shelf and it slipped. I swear before God it slipped." "Careless girl, Mrs. Ravensworth said. She did not raise her voice. She rarely needed to. Excuses are the language of incompetence, and I have heard enough of both for one morning. She turned, not to the maid, but to Mrs. Brixton, who had appeared in the doorway at the sound of breaking china. "See that the cost is deducted from her wages." Mrs. Brixton's mouth opened very slightly. "Ma'am, that vase was near £8, and the girl earns barely 12 in a 12-month. Then she will learn a valuable lesson in the handling of property that is not hers," Mrs. Ravensworth said, and walked from the room without troubling to see whether the matter was settled to anyone's satisfaction but her own. To her, it already was. To the girl kneeling on the floor with porcelain dust in the creases of her apron, it would be 8 months of nothing. Eugenia knelt to help gather the pieces before anyone could object, and Nan looked up at her with the particular gratitude of someone who has not been offered help in a very long time. "You needn't, Miss Marsh," she whispered. "You'll catch trouble yourself." "I have had worse trouble than a scolding," Eugenia said, and meant it more than the girl could know. It was 3 days later that Mrs. Ravensworth summoned her directly, a request that always arrived with a small cold weight attached to it, like a stone dropped into a pocket. Eugenia found her seated before the looking-glass in her dressing room, examining a length of pale blue silk that had arrived that week from a dressmaker on Sloane Street, the bill for which Eugenia herself had been required to enter into the household ledger that very morning. £16, 4 shillings. She had not forgotten the figure. "You, Mrs. Ravensworth said, without turning. "Come closer." Eugenia stepped forward and stood where she was told, hands folded in front of her plain grey dress, the wool gone slightly thin at the elbows from 3 winters of wear before it had ever come to her. "You are remarkably plain," Mrs. Ravensworth observed, studying her in the mirror rather than directly, as though it were easier to deliver an insult to a reflection than to a person. "I suppose that is fortunate. A pretty companion becomes a complication, in my experience, and I have no patience left for complications." Eugenia said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be turned, somehow, into further proof of insolence. "Has anyone ever mistaken you for a lady?" Mrs. Ravensworth asked, with the faint amusement of someone certain of the answer before it arrived. "No, ma'am," Eugenia said. "How sensible of them," Mrs. Ravensworth said, and lifted a teacup from the small table beside her, and then, without any visible cause, tilted it. A dark stain spread across the front of her own dressing gown, and she stared down at it with an expression of pure, theatrical astonishment, as though the tea had betrayed her of its own accord. "Look what you've done," she said. Eugenia had been standing 4 feet away with her hands folded the entire time. "My lady," she said carefully, "you startled me, but I did not. Now look at the state of me." Mrs. Ravensworth's voice hardened into something with an edge on it. "I cannot be seen this way. Kneel down and see to it at once." For 3 full seconds Eugenia did not move. In that silence she thought of her father, dead 2 years now, who had never once in her hearing raised his voice to a servant, who had taught her that a person's true character revealed itself most clearly in rooms where they believed no one of consequence was watching. She thought of the £8 that would cost Nan 8 months of her life. She thought of the 8 months she herself had left, by her own private reckoning, before the small sum she had managed to save would run out entirely and leave her with no recourse at all. She knelt. No tears, no protest, no flicker of anything Mrs. Ravensworth could later describe to her friends as insolence only, a steady, unhurried scrubbing of a stain that both women in that room understood had never been an accident at all. That evening, alone in the small room she had been given at the top of the house, Eugenia sat by the single candle she was permitted and pressed her palms flat against her knees to stop them shaking. Not from fear, but from a fury she had nowhere safe to put. Through the thin wall she could hear the house settling, The tick of a long case clock 2 floors below, the distant hiss of a gas lamp left burning too low in the corridor. She thought, not for the first time, of the letter folded inside her trunk, its wax seal cracked but still legible, the only piece of her old life she had brought with her into this one. Mr. Whitlock's hand. Patience, Lady Isolde, it had said. The last time he had dared address her by that name on paper. The proof exists. It will take time to gather what was destroyed. 11 months. She had begun to wonder how much longer patience could be asked to last. The financial state of the household was a subject discussed everywhere within its walls, except, apparently, by the people responsible for it. Eugenia first understood the scale of it on an afternoon in October, while carrying a basket of mended linens toward the eastern stair, and passing 2 footmen wrestling with a delivery of wooden crates from the front hall. One crate had split along its seam, spilling bottles of imported French scent across the marble, and the younger of the 2 footmen swore under his breath as he gathered them up. "Another shipment for Mrs. Ravensworth," he muttered to his companion. "That makes 3 this fortnight." The other man shook his head. "At this rate, she'll spend the family into the workhouse herself, and never notice she's done it." Eugenia continued on as though she had heard nothing, which was, by then, a skill she had perfected nearly as well as mending linen. But the comment stayed with her because she had heard a version of it before, 3 weeks earlier, while delivering fresh candles to the unused corridor outside the estate offices on the 2nd floor. The door to the study had been left a hand's width open, and the voices within belonged unmistakably to Cedric Ravensworth and his wife, Mr. Ravensworth, who styled himself, with a confidence that had never once been formally tested by law, Lord Ravensworth, and was addressed as such by every tradesman, hostess, and acquaintance in Belgravia who had no reason to doubt him, sat behind a mahogany desk scattered with ledgers, rubbing his temples with the particular weariness of a man who has gambled away more than he is willing to admit even to himself. "The creditors grow impatient," he was saying. "Hartshorn's bank wrote again this week, nearly £4,000 outstanding, Augusta, and that is before we account for what is owed at the club." "Then perhaps," his wife replied, settling into the chair opposite with the ease of a woman who has had this conversation before and expects to win it, "Lionel's marriage will solve the difficulty rather more efficiently than your restraint ever has." "It will solve everything," Cedric said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite relief, more the grim satisfaction of a man closing a trap. "The Pratts have railway money behind them, and old Josiah Pratt is desperate enough for a title in the family that he will not look too closely at our books before the wedding. Once the settlement is signed, the house is safe for a generation. And mine," Augusta said, with the faintest, satisfied smile. "I do not care what becomes of your share," Cedric said. "Once it is no longer my concern to account for it." Eugenia stood very still in the corridor outside, a single candle gripped so tightly in her hand that the wax had begun to soften against her glove. She had known, in the abstract, that the family's wealth was a performance staged for an audience of creditors and society hostesses alike. She had not understood, until that moment, that the performance had a closing date and that the curtain was meant to fall on the back of a girl named Henrietta Pratt, who had likely never been told the truth of what she was buying into. It was in the kitchens, 2 days later, that Eugenia finally heard the name that had haunted the house since before her arrival. A name the servants spoke only when they believed themselves entirely alone. She had been set to peeling vegetables beside an elderly kitchen maid named Hodges, the room thick with the smell of onions and wood smoke, and a stockpot simmering since dawn, and the rain outside had loosened tongues that were ordinarily kept carefully shut. Eugenia, with the studied casualness of someone who has rehearsed a question many times before asking it, said, "I have heard the family speak of a Lady Isolde. Was she a relation?" The knife in Hodges's hand stopped moving. "The old Earl's daughter," she said at last, very quietly. "Sent away to a great-aunt in the north the winter after her father died. On account of her grief, we were told." The way she said "we were told" carried the precise, careful weight of a woman who had stopped believing the explanation years ago. but had never found it safe to say so aloud. "And she never returned," Eugenia said. "Never that anyone in this house has seen," Hodges said. "Mr. Ravensworth says she chose to remain abroad. Mrs. Ravensworth says she is delicate and unsuited to society." The old woman's hands resumed their work, slow and deliberate. "Mr. Crewe, who has been steward here since before any of us were born, will not speak of it at all, which tells you more than either of the others, if you've a mind to listen." "I do listen," Eugenia said, and something in her voice must have carried more weight than she intended, because Hodges glanced up at her sharply for just a moment, the way one notices a draught from a window one had believed was shut. That night, Eugenia lay awake, long after the house had gone silent, listening to the rain against the leaded glass, and allowed herself, for the first time in 11 months, something dangerously close to hope. The pressure inside Ravensworth House did not announce itself so much as accumulate, the way damp gathers in a cellar long before anyone notices the smell. Mr. Whitlock's letters, smuggled to her through a sympathetic laundress who collected post from a chemist's shop 2 streets distant, grew shorter and more urgent through the autumn. "The Garter King of Arms has agreed to examine the patent," one read. Another, "3 weeks on, I have located the housekeeper who attended your mother in her confinement. Her testimony alone may be sufficient, should it come to that." Eugenia read each one twice and burned it in the grate before dawn, watching Mr. Whitlock's careful copperplate curl black and vanish, and told herself that patience was simply another name for survival. She had nearly convinced herself of it when Cedric Ravensworth's gambling debts forced the household's desperation into the open, and the engagement that would settle them was announced for the 3rd Thursday of November. A ball, lavish well past the family's actual means, to celebrate the betrothal of the Honourable Lionel Ravensworth to Miss Henrietta Pratt, only daughter of Mr. Josiah Pratt, whose railway interests had made him one of the wealthiest commoners in England, and whose ambitions for his daughter had made him, in Cedric's private estimation, conveniently blind to anything that might delay the wedding. The day Henrietta Pratt's gown arrived from a dressmaker in Paris, in a box large enough to have held a coffin, the entire household turned out to watch it unveiled in the drawing-room as though it were a religious relic. Eugenia stood near the wall with a tray of refreshments she had not been asked to set down, watching Mrs. Ravensworth lift the lid with something close to reverence. "Pearls," she breathed, touching the embroidery along the bodice. "It will be the talk of every drawing-room in London. See that the girl looks perfect on the day," Cedric said, raising a glass of sherry though it was not yet noon. "Beautiful women attract sympathy from everyone watching, and we shall want every ounce of it we can get." A few of the assembled guests laughed politely, unsure whether the remark was meant as a joke. Then a thin, sharp-faced gentleman named Lionel Montague, an old friend of Cedric's from his club, raised his own glass in a kind of toast. "Especially," he said, "before they disappear." The laughter died at once. Eugenia felt something cold move through her chest, because in that single sentence she heard, unmistakably, the echo of every fragment Hodges had given her in the kitchen. "Sent away. Never returned. Will not speak of it at all." She looked around the room and saw, for a single unguarded instant, real fear pass across the faces of Cedric, of Augusta, even of Lionel himself, before each of them smoothed it away beneath practiced smiles. Nobody laughed at Montague's joke. Nobody asked him to explain it. The silence that followed was its own answer, and Eugenia understood, with a certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that whatever had truly happened to the woman they no longer named in that house, it had not been grief, and it had not been delicate health, and it had very likely not been anything either Cedric or Augusta would survive having spoken of in open court. By her 4th week of close attention to the household's private corners, Eugenia had begun to understand that Ravensworth House operated on 2 entirely separate accounts, one for show, conducted in drawing-rooms and ballrooms, before an audience that paid in admiration, and one conducted in back offices and account books, paid in debts nobody outside the family was meant to see. She found the second account almost by accident, sent one wet afternoon to fetch a missing ledger from the estate office, while Cedric was out, and Mr. Crewe, the elderly steward, had stepped away to attend the front door. The desk was a wreckage of unpaid bills. She recognized, with the particular bitterness of long practice, the handwriting of half the tradesmen in Belgravia, a coach builder, a wine merchant, a jeweler in Bond Street, whose final demand was underlined twice in red ink. Beneath them, half hidden under a stack of correspondence, lay a slim folder tied with faded ribbon and marked, in a hand she recognized instantly because it was her own father's, Ravensworth succession. Her fingers had only just closed around it when she heard Mr. Crewe's footsteps returning down the corridor. Unhurried, deliberate, the tread of a man who had walked those particular boards for 40 years and knew every creak in them by name. She had no time to read it. She had time only to slide it back beneath the bills, exactly as she had found it, smooth her skirts, and bend over the ledger she had ostensibly been sent to retrieve, her heart beating hard enough that she was certain it must be audible across the room. Mr. Crewe paused in the doorway. He was a tall, spare man, with white side whiskers, and the kind of stillness that came from a lifetime of standing in rooms where powerful people said things they later wished forgotten. His eyes moved once, briefly, to the desk, then to her face, and lingered there a moment longer than courtesy required. "You have your father's hands," he said quietly. Eugenia went very still. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Crewe?" He said nothing further. He only held the door for her, with the same correct, expressionless courtesy he extended to every member of the household, and as she passed him in the corridor she could have sworn, though she would spend the following 3 days telling herself she had imagined it, that he inclined his head to her by perhaps half an inch more than strict politeness demanded. The accusation, when it came, arrived with the particular cruelty of being entirely manufactured. 3 days before the engagement ball, Augusta Ravensworth assembled the household staff in the servants' hall, her face composed into an expression of grave, regretful authority, and announced that a piece of jewelry belonging to the family had gone missing from her dressing room. "A sapphire pin," she said, "worth upward of £60, last seen the previous Sunday. It appears," she said, her gaze travelling slowly across the assembled rows of maids and footmen, "that someone among you has forgotten their place rather badly." Nobody spoke. Eugenia, standing near the back beside Nan, felt the younger girl's hand find hers and grip it, white-knuckled. "Beginning today," Augusta continued, "every room will be searched, every trunk, every drawer, every private possession. If the guilty party is discovered, dismissal will be immediate. And I promise you, without character, without reference, and without the smallest particle of my sympathy." Eugenia understood, watching her, that the missing pin was very likely sitting exactly where Augusta had left it, and that this was never truly about a piece of jewelry at all. It was about information. Someone in the house suspected that something was leaking outward, a letter, a rumor, a question asked too pointedly in the wrong company, and the search was a net cast wide enough to catch it, regardless of how many innocent women it frightened on the way. The searches lasted 4 days. Trunks were emptied onto narrow servants' beds, private letters read aloud by footmen who clearly relished the smallest scrap of power it gave them. A girl named Polly, dismissed without notice, simply for owning a ribbon Augusta did not recognize, and chose, on a whim, to declare stolen. Through it all, Eugenia kept Mr. Whitlock's letters burned each morning before the sun rose high enough to risk discovery, and slept, when she slept at all, with her father's folded letter sewn into the lining of her one good coat. It was during this same anxious week that Augusta began, for reasons Eugenia did not yet fully understand, to take a closer and more deliberate interest in her companion than she ever had before. She was summoned one afternoon to Augusta's private sitting room, where the air smelled of orange flower water and fresh roses, and found her seated beside a tea service with a fashion periodical open on her knee, examining her with the particular, unhurried attention of a woman setting a trap she expects to enjoy springing. "Pour the tea," Augusta said. Eugenia obeyed. Augusta watched every motion of her hands with a closeness that made the simple act feel like an examination, which, Eugenia understood a moment too late, it precisely was. "You are surprisingly well-spoken for a companion," Augusta said, once the cup had been set before her. "Far better spoken than your wages would suggest." "I try to speak properly, my lady," Eugenia said carefully, clearly. Augusta's smile did not reach her eyes. She lifted the cup, studied Eugenia over the rim of it, and asked, with the air of someone inquiring after the weather, "What is the capital of Austria?" For one suspended moment, Eugenia felt the floor tilt beneath her. The question was harmless on its surface, and entirely deliberate beneath it, the kind of fact a companion of modest education would have no particular reason to know, and a woman raised with a governess and a schoolroom globe would answer without thinking. "I could not say, my lady," Eugenia said, lowering her eyes. "And what language is spoken in Florence?" "I do not know, my lady." Augusta tapped one finger slowly against the rim of her cup, a small, precise sound that filled the silence of the room like a clock striking. The questions continued for several minutes. Books, foreign cities, the kind of polite drawing-room knowledge expected of a gentleman's daughter and entirely unnecessary in a paid companion. And each time Eugenia balanced herself on the narrow edge between two equally fatal mistakes. Too knowing, and she would expose herself. Too ignorant, and she would appear to be hiding something far less innocent than ignorance. At last, Augusta sat back, faint disappointment crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "You may go," she said. Eugenia rose, curtsied, and walked from the room with a composure she did not feel in the slightest. And only once she had reached the privacy of the back stair did she allow her hands to shake. She had escaped. She understood, with absolute clarity, that she had escaped only barely, and that Augusta Ravensworth's suspicion, once roused, was not the sort of thing that settled back to sleep on its own. Lionel Ravensworth, by contrast, paid her almost no attention at all, which Eugenia had come to understand was its own particular brand of cruelty, quieter than his mother's, but no less corrosive for its quiet. He was a tall, fair young man, with his father's easy confidence, and none of his father's patience for the labor of maintaining it, and he treated the household staff the way he treated furniture useful, expected, and beneath the trouble of acknowledgement. At dinner one evening, when a footman misjudged the angle of a serving dish and spilled a thin line of gravy across the white cloth, Lionel did not raise his voice or summon the housekeeper. He simply looked at the stain, then at the footman, and said, to no one in particular, that he did wonder sometimes whether the agency supplying their staff trained them at all, or simply gathered whoever was willing to work for the wages on offer. The footman's ears went scarlet. He said nothing, because there was nothing a servant in that position could safely say, and continued serving as though the remark had cost him nothing whatsoever. It was a fortnight after the questions about Austria and Florence that Eugenia received word, through the laundress on the corner of Chester Street, that Mr. Whitlock wished to meet her in person, rather than trust further news to paper. The arrangement was simple and entirely against the household's rules, a half-hour's absence on a Sunday afternoon, while the family attended church, and the staff were permitted their own brief liberty, spent instead in the back parlor of a chemist's shop 2 streets distant, where Whitlock waited with his hat in his hands, and an expression she had not seen on him before. "We have found the housekeeper who attended your mother in childbed," he said, without preamble, the moment the door was shut behind her. "She is an old woman now, living quietly in Richmond, and she has agreed to swear before a magistrate that your birth was properly recorded, and that the entry in the parish register near Ravensworth Hall, the one your cousin's man of business altered 6 years ago, does not match the original she herself witnessed entered by the rector's own hand." Eugenia sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "And the will?" she asked. "My father's instrument of succession." "Destroyed," Whitlock said grimly. "Or so your cousin believes. He did not know, when he ordered it burned, that your father had lodged a duplicate with the College of Arms itself, sealed and witnessed, the year before he died, a precaution. I have come to suspect, born of some private unease about his nephew's character, that he never lived to act upon fully." He paused, I have it now. I have had it for 3 weeks. What I lack, still, is the right moment to use it, and the right room full of witnesses to make certain it cannot quietly be buried a second time. The engagement ball, Eugenia said quietly. It was less a question than a recognition arriving fully formed. Whitlock studied her for a long moment, the lamplight catching the grey at his temples, and something in his expression softened into something almost paternal, the look of a man who had served her father faithfully and found, in serving the daughter, a debt he was finally able to repay in full. It will draw every person in London whose good opinion your cousin has spent the family's last shillings courting, he said. If the truth is to matter to anyone beyond these 4 walls, my lady, that is the room in which it must be spoken. Then let it be spoken there, Eugenia said. And for the first time in 11 months, she allowed herself to feel something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but stood very close to both. A week before the ball, Eugenia was sent to assist at the final fitting of Henrietta Pratt's gown, held in the music room where the light was thought best for judging silk, and asked to hold a cushion of pins while a dressmaker's assistant worked along the hem. The room was crowded with discarded tissue paper and the sharp, particular smell of new fabric sizing, and Augusta presided over the whole affair from a chaise near the window, directing adjustments with the precision of a general arranging troops. A pin slipped, as pins occasionally do in tired hands at the end of a long afternoon, and caught the side of Eugenia's thumb deeply enough to draw a single bright bead of blood, which fell, before she could stop it, against the very edge of the gown's pale hem. Augusta was on her feet before the dressmaker's assistant had even finished gasping. "Get that creature's hands away from the silk," she said, her voice carrying the flat, instinctive disgust of a woman who had just watched something she considered beneath her touch, the thing she valued most. "Servants always carry something on their fingers, dirt or worse, and I will not have Miss Pratt married in a gown that has been bled on by the help." "It was an accident, ma'am," Eugenia said, pressing the cut against her apron to stop the small flow before it could mark anything further. "I am sorry for it." "Sorry does not unmake a stain," Augusta said. "Stand back and keep your hands to yourself for the remainder of the fitting, unless you would like me to find a companion who can manage to exist in a room without ruining something in it." Henrietta, standing very still upon the small dressmaker's stool in the center of the room, said nothing at all, though her eyes flicked once, briefly, toward Eugenia, with an expression that might have been sympathy, had she possessed the courage, yet to let it show on her face for longer than an instant. Eugenia stepped back as instructed, the cut throbbing faintly beneath her apron, and said nothing further, because by then she had learned precisely how little good her own defense had ever done her in that house, and precisely how much could be gained, in the right room and the right hour, by simply waiting. A creditor's visit, 5 days before the ball, gave Eugenia a clearer view of the household's desperation than any overheard conversation had managed yet. A jeweler's clerk from Bond Street arrived at the front door, hat in hand, with the final demand for an outstanding bill that had grown, with interest, to nearly £300, and was kept waiting the better part of an hour in the cold front hall, while Cedric composed himself enough to receive him in the drawing-room. Eugenia, sent to bring refreshment neither man touched, heard Cedric's voice through the half-open door, pitched low and urgent in a register entirely unlike the easy confidence he wore for his equals. "A fortnight," he was saying. "2 at the outside. There is a marriage settlement being arranged that will clear every account this family holds, and I will not have it jeopardized by a tradesman's impatience over a sum that will be paid in full the moment the ink is dry." The clerk's reply was too quiet for her to catch, but his expression, when he passed her in the hall on his way out, carried the particular weariness of a man who had heard that exact promise from that exact household more than once before, and had stopped, some months ago, believing it. It was that same evening that Augusta found her in the upstairs corridor, a stack of freshly mended linens in her arms, and stopped her with a hand against the wall, blocking her path with the deliberate carelessness of a woman accustomed to never having her movements questioned. "This passage leads to the family's private rooms," Augusta said, her voice pitched for an audience, though no one else stood near enough to hear it. "It is not a corridor for a companion to wander at her leisure, whatever errand she has invented to excuse it. I was asked to return these to the linen press, ma'am," Eugenia said evenly, lifting the stack slightly as proof. Augusta's eyes moved over her with the particular contempt she reserved for moments when she suspected, without quite being able to prove it, that she was being quietly outmaneuvered. "A companion's wages are paid for her silence and her usefulness," she said, "not for her opinions on which passages she is and is not entitled to walk. I begin to wonder whether someone has neglected to explain the terms of your employment to you with sufficient clarity." "I understand them perfectly, ma'am," Eugenia said. "Then see that you remember them," Augusta said, and swept past her down the very corridor she had just forbidden, leaving Eugenia standing alone with an armful of linen and the small, steady certainty that whatever remained of this household's patience with her, it would not last very much longer. The breaking point arrived on a bright, deceptively gentle afternoon, 4 days before the engagement ball, in the private garden at the center of Eaton Square, where the residents of the surrounding houses were permitted to take tea among the plane trees on fine days and pretend, for an hour or two, that London possessed something like countryside. Augusta had arranged a small gathering to introduce Henrietta Pratt more fully to society. Before the formal celebration, a dozen guests, white cloths laid over 2 long tables, a footman stationed to pour champagne that the family could not, in any strict accounting, afford. Eugenia had been brought along to carry shawls and fetch whatever was wanted, a role she had performed so many times by then that she could do it without troubling to think. It was Henrietta Pratt herself, in fact, who very nearly undid her without meaning to. She was a soft-spoken, anxious young woman, clearly out of her depth among a circle of titled guests who regarded her father's railway fortune with the particular condescension reserved for money too recently made, and she had taken, over the course of the afternoon, an evident liking to the quiet companion who refilled her teacup without being asked twice. As the gathering broke into smaller knots of conversation, she touched Eugenia's sleeve. "You have a kind face," she said, with the simple honesty of someone unused to London's careful cruelties. "I confess I find you easier to talk to than half the company here. What is your name again, Marsh, was it?" "Eugenia Marsh. My lady, miss," Eugenia corrected herself, too quickly, the slip costing her half a breath. It was the half-breath that did it. Augusta, 3 feet away, and engaged in what had appeared to be an entirely separate conversation, turned her head with the swiftness of a woman whose attention never truly wandered as far as it pretended to. Her eyes moved over Eugenia's face with a new and dangerous intensity, as though searching it for something she had nearly forgotten to look for. And what she found there, whether a resemblance, a familiarity, or simply the confirmation of a suspicion she had been nursing since the afternoon of the teacups, was enough to drain the careful pleasantness from her expression entirely. "Eugenia," she said, in a voice gone suddenly, deliberately loud, "not Marsh." How peculiar that a companion should answer to a Christian name as though she were a lady of the house. Several guests turned. Henrietta's hand fell away from her sleeve. "It is only a name, ma'am," Eugenia said carefully. "My mother chose it. I have never claimed any right to it beyond that." Augusta crossed the small distance between them in 3 sharp steps, and the company fell silent in the particular way an English garden party falls silent, not through any spoken instruction, but through a collective, practiced instinct that something was about to happen which everyone would later claim not to have witnessed too closely. Her hand caught Eugenia across the cheek before anyone present could decide whether to intervene, the sound of it flat and shocking against the birdsong and the clink of abandoned teacups. "You have been growing far too bold under this roof," Augusta said, her voice shaking now with something closer to fear than to anger, though only Eugenia, watching her closely, understood the difference. A companion who forgets her place is worse than one who never learned it at all. Eugenia did not lift her hand to the mark already rising on her cheek. She did not step back. She stood entirely still. And in that stillness, something passed across her face that was not fear at all. a composure so absolute that for one unguarded second it was Augusta, not Eugenia, who looked uncertain of what she had begun. "You will pack your trunk this evening," Augusta continued, recovering herself, "and you will leave this house without character, without reference, and without the smallest hope of respectable employment again. Do you understand me? And you will be grateful I do not send for a constable besides." No one at that table spoke in her defense. Mr. Pratt studied his gloves with sudden fascination. The other ladies found urgent reasons to examine their teacups. Even Henrietta, who a moment earlier had called her kind-faced, looked away toward the plane trees rather than meet anyone's eye, and Eugenia understood, watching the silence settle over a dozen well-dressed witnesses, that this not the slap, not the threat of the workhouse that hung unspoken beneath every word of dismissal without character. This was the true cruelty of the house she had lived in for 11 months. Not that Augusta Ravensworth struck a woman she believed powerless, that an entire garden full of people who knew better chose every one of them to let her. "Yes, ma'am," Eugenia said quietly, and the words cost her nothing at all, because by then she had already decided, with a calm that surprised even her, that she would not need to pack a trunk that evening after all. The night of the engagement ball, Ravensworth House blazed with more gas and candlelight than it had carried in years, every chandelier lit, every mirror polished, until it doubled the glitter of the room behind it. Carriages lined Eaton Square 3 deep, broughams and landaus disgorging the better part of titled London onto a red carpet laid specially for the occasion, and inside, beneath the weight of borrowed splendor and unpaid bills alike, Cedric Ravensworth stood receiving congratulations on a match he had arranged with all the tenderness of a man closing a sale. The air smelled of beeswax and hothouse lilies, and the particular sharp sweetness of champagne that had been chilled too quickly. And beneath the orchestra's careful waltz, Eugenia could hear the small, ordinary sounds of the house she had learned so thoroughly over 11 months. The hiss of a gas jet turned slightly too high near the second window, the rustle of silk against marble each time a guest crossed the floor, the long case clock in the hall striking the half-hour with the same unhurried patience it had kept through every cruelty she had witnessed beneath this roof. She had spent the better part of the afternoon turning Whitlock's letter over in her mind, memorizing the hour he had named, and even now, moving through the crowd with a tray balanced against her hip, she found herself counting the minutes, the way she had once counted the days remaining on her savings. Eugenia moved through the edges of the crowd as she always did, a tray in her hands, a plain grey gown chosen specifically, she suspected, to make certain she was never mistaken for one of the guests. It was a little before 11 o'clock, by the long case clock in the hall, when the first carriage wheels sounded on the gravel of the square that did not belong to any guest still expected. A few heads turned near the windows. The orchestra, tucked into the corner beneath a bank of hothouse flowers, faltered for half a bar and recovered. But the sound continued, not the light trot of a hired hansom, but the heavier, deliberate roll of a private carriage drawn by a matched pair, and something in its unhurried pace silenced one conversation, then another, then a third, until a curious hush had spread outward from the windows like ripples crossing still water. Through the tall glass, illuminated by the gas lamps along the square, the assembled guests watched a dark, well-appointed brougham draw to a halt directly before the door. A crest was worked into the carriage door in gold leaf, weathered with age but entirely legible to anyone in that room who had grown up beneath a coat of arms of their own, and a murmur went through the crowd as several guests recognized it before they could quite believe what they were recognizing. "Ravensworth," someone said quietly. "That is the old arms, the proper arms." Cedric Ravensworth's smile, fixed in place for the better part of 2 hours, did not so much fade as collapse all at once, the way a structure fails when a single beam beneath it finally gives way. The footman at the door, trained for 11 years to announce arrivals in a voice that carried to the back of any room, opened the door and found himself, for a moment, entirely without words. Then he drew himself up and spoke into a silence that had, by then, swallowed the entire ballroom. "Mr. Bertram Whitlock, solicitor," he announced. And Mr. Crewe, a tall, silver-haired man in a sober black coat, crossed the threshold, a leather document case beneath his arm, and beside him walked Mr. Crewe, the family's own steward, his face composed into an expression none of the household had ever seen him wear before, not deference, but something closer to quiet, long-deferred satisfaction. Whitlock's eyes swept the room once, briefly, and found Cedric Ravensworth standing frozen near the center of it. "Mr. Ravensworth," he said, with perfect, devastating courtesy, "I apologize for the lateness of the hour." The matter could not wait a single day longer. Cedric found his voice, though it came out thinner than he intended. "Whitlock, this is neither the time nor you were instructed years ago that your services were no longer required in this house." "I was instructed," Whitlock agreed, "by a man with no legal authority whatsoever to give that instruction." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence of 200 guests did the work for him. "I act, and have always acted, for the true heir of the 6th Earl of Ravensworth, whose patent of creation, granted in the reign of the 2nd George, descends not merely to heirs male, but to heirs general, a provision so uncommon that the College of Arms required the better part of a year to confirm it beyond doubt, and which your own man of business attempted, 6 years ago, to suppress entirely by destroying the relevant instrument and removing the rightful heir from this house under the pretense of grief." A sound moved through the ballroom that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, the particular sound of 200 people simultaneously realizing they had been wrong about something for a very long time. Whitlock turned and crossed the floor without a single glance towards Cedric Ravensworth, who stood as though the marble beneath him had turned suddenly to ice. He walked instead toward the edge of the room, where a companion in a plain grey gown stood with an abandoned tray still balanced on one arm, and stopped before her, and bowed not the small, correct inclination owed to a lady's companion, but a full, deliberate bow, the kind owed to exactly one rank of person in any room in England. "My lady," he said, "forgive me. I had hoped to come sooner." A confused murmur rippled outward. Several guests laughed, uncertainly, as though waiting to be told it was a joke. "You will not be laughing in a moment," said a second voice, and Mr. Crewe stepped forward, his old steward's composure cracking at last into something almost unbearably human. He had served this house for 40 years and watched, for the last 6 of them, a fraud he had been threatened into silence over. "I have known this lady since she was an infant in her mother's arms," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I attended her christening. I have her father's own hand upon her birth, recorded in the parish register not 3 miles from where we stand tonight. There is no doubt in this matter, nor has there ever been, in anyone willing to look honestly at it." He turned toward her, and his composure broke entirely, and he said, simply, "Lady Isolde." For a moment nobody moved. Eugenia Isolde set the tray down upon the nearest table, with hands that did not shake, though every other part of her felt as though it might. "I have worn another woman's name for 11 months, she said, into a silence so complete that her voice, though quiet, reached the farthest corner of the ballroom without effort. "I have answered to it because I had no safer choice, and because the truth, spoken too soon and without proof, would have ended in nothing but my own ruin at this family's hands." She reached up and drew the plain shawl from her shoulders, let it fall, and unpinned, with deliberate, unhurried fingers, the cap that had concealed her hair beneath its careful, servant's plainness for nearly a year. Beneath it, dark hair fell loose to her shoulders, and something in the line of her bearing straightened now, no longer practiced into smallness, made more than one guest in that room recall, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, a portrait that hung in the long gallery upstairs of a young woman with precisely that same composed, level gaze. "I am Isolde Ravensworth," she said, "daughter of Edmund, 6th Earl of Ravensworth, and by the terms of his patent, Countess of Ravensworth, in my own right. I did not come to this house tonight to claim that title before you. I came to learn how thoroughly it had been stolen, And from how many people besides myself? Cedric Ravensworth opened his mouth, and what emerged was not denial but something closer to bargaining. This is a misunderstanding, a complicated matter of succession law, hardly suitable for. It is entirely suitable, said Whitlock, opening his document case, for the room that has spent the past hour drinking your champagne and admiring your wife's diamonds, all of it purchased, as the household accounts will show any magistrate who cares to examine them, on credit secured against an estate, to which neither of you holds the smallest legal claim. It was then that the first witness stepped forward, Mrs. Brixton, still in her plain housekeeper's black, her hands clasped before her, her voice unsteady but resolved. I have served this house under 3 different mistresses, she said, addressing the assembled guests directly, though every fibre of her training screamed against it. I was instructed. The winter Lady Isolde was sent north, never to speak of her again, under any circumstance, on pain of dismissal without character. I have wages docked from frightened girls for breakages no court would hold them responsible for. I have watched good food thrown to waste while servants went without, because Mrs. Ravensworth believed that kindness, once permitted, could never again be controlled. She drew a breath. I have wanted to say these things for 6 years. I am saying them now. Nan came next, white-faced but steady, describing the deduction of 8 months' wages for a vase she had not deliberately broken, her voice growing surer as she spoke, as though courage, once witnessed in someone else, proved contagious. A footman Isolde did not recognize by name stepped forward after her, describing threats made against any servant who spoke too freely to Lady Isolde's old governess, who had once come calling and been turned away from the door with a story about delicate health that nobody below stairs had ever believed. Then Hodges came forward from among the kitchen staff gathered near the service door, her apron still dusted with flour from the evening's preparations, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice did not. I have cooked for this house for 22 years, she said, addressing the assembled guests with the plain dignity of a woman who had nothing left to lose by speaking honestly. I remember the night the old Earl died, and I remember how quickly the locks were changed on the estate office the very next morning before the body had been a full day in its coffin. I was told never to speak of his daughter again, and like every soul in this house, I obeyed because obedience was the only thing standing between myself and the workhouse. She looked, for a moment, directly at Isolde. I am glad, my lady, to see you've no further need of my silence. Each testimony chipped away at something the room had spent 6 years agreeing not to notice, and Isolde, watching it happen, understood that this was the true purpose of a tribunal, not merely to establish facts a magistrate could later confirm in some quieter chamber, but to return to every person who had ever been frightened into silence beneath that roof the simple right to be believed in public, by witnesses, in the same drawing rooms where their fear had once been manufactured. Then Whitlock drew a bundle of letters from his case, tied with the same kind of ribbon Isolde had glimpsed once, briefly, on a folder she had not dared to open. These, he said, were recovered from the man of business you employed to destroy Lady Isolde's father's instrument of succession, Mr. Ravensworth, a man who, faced with the prospect of his own prosecution, proved considerably more willing to testify against you than you perhaps anticipated. He held one aloft, Cedric's own hand unmistakable across the page even from a distance. In this letter, dated the 11th of February, 6 years past, you instruct him directly to ensure that, and I quote your own words to this room, the girl is sent far enough away that no one troubles to ask whether her claim still exists. A low sound moved through the crowd, equal parts horror and recognition, the sound of a great many people quietly recalculating every kindness they had ever extended to the Ravensworths. No denial reached her lips quickly enough to matter. No excuse arrived that the room had not already heard contradicted in Cedric's own handwriting. No flicker of the easy authority she had worn for 6 years remained on her face. Only Augusta Ravensworth, who had not spoken a single word since the carriage first arrived, finding her voice at last, thin and brittle. We did what was necessary for the good of this family's name. You did what was necessary for your own comfort, Isolde said. and there was no anger in her voice at all, only a terrible, level clarity that silenced the room more completely than shouting ever could have. You deducted 8 months from a housemaid's wages over a broken vase, and spent £16 the same week on a length of silk. You struck me in front of a dozen witnesses for the crime of answering to my own Christian name. You built this house's entire reputation on the assumption that no one beneath you would ever be believed over someone above. She paused, and into that pause she set down, one by one, the things that could not be unsaid. The debts entered against the Ravensworth estate by Mr. Cedric Ravensworth are his own, and his alone, to settle from this night forward. No further credit will be extended against my father's name. Every servant in this house, who has been threatened into silence on my account, will remain in my service, at double their present wages, for as long as they wish to stay. And you, she said, looking at last directly at the man who had worn her father's title for 6 years he had never legally possessed, will vacate this house by the end of the week, and you will do so without the smallest further claim upon a name that was never, in any sense the law recognizes, yours to wear. Across the ballroom, Mr. Josiah Pratt had gone the color of old ash. He took his daughter's arm without a word, and steered her, gently but with unmistakable finality, toward the door and the engagement that had brought 200 guests through Ravensworth House's doors that night, quietly, irretrievably, ceased to exist before anyone troubled to announce it. What followed in the weeks after the ball moved with a speed that surprised even Isolde, who had spent 6 years learning precisely how slowly justice could crawl when it was made to wait upon proof. The College of Arms confirmed the patent within a fortnight, the matter having already been substantially examined in the months before Whitlock judged it safe to act, and the confirmation, once published, removed from Cedric Ravensworth the courtesy title he had worn so comfortably for so long that he had very nearly come to believe in it himself. Harchhorn's Bank, no longer willing to extend credit against an estate he did not hold, called in what remained of his debts within the month, very nearly £4,000. Besides the smaller sums owed to half the tradesmen of Belgravia, and without the protection of a name that no longer belonged to him, Cedric found those debts considerably less patient than they had been. The Pratts, for their part, did not simply withdraw the engagement. Josiah Pratt, a man who had built a railway fortune on the principle that bad investments should be cut quickly and without sentiment, called in the loan he had quietly extended to Cedric some 18 months before, secured, he now discovered, against nothing more solid than a title that was never legally his collateral to offer. Word of the engagement's collapse, and the reasons behind it, moved through London with the particular efficiency reserved for scandal, involving both an old name and new money. By the second week of December, invitations to the house in Eaton Square had ceased arriving altogether, and the few calls still paid there were paid by creditors rather than friends. Isolde did not take any particular pleasure in watching it unfold, though she would not have called what she felt regret either. She had judgment to dispense, and very little appetite left for cruelty for its own sake. She allowed Augusta Ravensworth to keep her personal jewelry, the genuine pieces inherited rather than purchased on credit, and arranged, through Whitlock, for Cedric's modest income from a small property in Hampshire, the one asset that had, in fact, been legitimately his to remain his own, on the understanding that he would trouble Ravensworth House and its mistress no further. By the end of January, the family that had occupied the house for 6 years had quietly removed to the continent, where Mr. Crewe reported with something close to satisfaction. The Ravensworth name carried considerably less weight than it once had in Belgravia. The house itself took longer to recover than its accounts did. Isolde walked its corridors that winter, the way a person walks through a home half remembered from childhood, recognizing the bones of it, the long gallery, the breakfast room, the small sitting room where Augusta had once tested her with questions about Florence and Austria while finding the flesh of it entirely changed. She had the portrait of her mother, the late Countess, moved from the dim corner of the gallery, where it had been quietly relegated for 6 years to the place of honor above the drawing-room mantel, where the gas lamps caught the painted silk of her gown each evening and threw a soft, steady light across features Isolde had spent years trying to remember without a likeness to help her. She kept Mrs. Brixton on as housekeeper, with full charge of the household accounts, and a salary that finally reflected the responsibility she had carried, unrewarded, for years. She kept Nan as well, though not in service. Within a month, the girl had been placed instead with a respectable dressmaker on Sloane Street to learn a trade of her own. The 8 months' wages once stolen from her returned threefold, along with a small sum set aside toward her independence. Once her apprenticeship was complete, Mr. Crewe stayed on as steward, as he had asked to, declining the comfortable retirement Isolde offered him with a quiet insistence that he intended to see the house properly run for a few years yet. Having waited rather a long time for the privilege, by the following spring, Ravensworth House had begun, slowly, to resemble itself again, not the brittle, anxious grandeur Cedric and Augusta had maintained on borrowed money, but something steadier, built on accounts that balanced, and a staff that no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Isolde instituted, with Mrs. Brixton's careful guidance, a new system for the household below stairs, fair notice before any dismissal, a proper character given to any servant who left her service in good standing, wages reviewed and raised twice yearly rather than left to stagnate for a decade at a time. Mrs. Brixton, with characteristic dryness, took to calling the new arrangement dignity in service. Whenever a newer maid asked why the household ran so differently from every other in the square, and the name, half in jest at first, settled into something the staff repeated with genuine pride rather than irony. She set aside, from the income the estate was now, for the first time in years, actually generating, rather than borrowing against, a modest fund for the education of servants' children in the parish nearest Ravensworth Hall in Yorkshire, the family seat she had not seen since she was a girl of 17, and intended, that coming summer, finally, to visit again. In April, she received a letter from Henrietta Pratt, the first either woman had written the other. Though Isolde had thought of her often since that afternoon in the square garden, the kindness offered to a companion who could not, at the time, afford to return it. Henrietta wrote that her father had recovered the better part of his loan, that she herself had broken off no further engagements since, and that she hoped, when Isolde's mourning for her old life had run its proper course, they might be permitted to call themselves friends, rather than merely two women who had survived the same family's calculations. Isolde wrote back the same week, and meant every word of her reply. On a cold, bright afternoon at the end of February, Mrs. Brixton organized what she called, with characteristic understatement, a small gathering for the household, though by the time word had spread through the servants' grapevine, it had grown to include nearly everyone who had ever worked beneath that roof and left it, willingly or otherwise. In the 6 years of Cedric Ravensworth's tenure, they met in the kitchen and the adjoining scullery, the largest warm rooms the house possessed, with the stoves banked high and trestle tables borrowed from the local chop house laid end to end, covered in roast fowl and seed cake, and a great deal more sherry than the occasion strictly required. Isolde came down to join them herself, which surprised no one quite as much as it pleased them, and found Hodges seated near the largest stove with a cup of punch in her hand and an expression of pure, unguarded contentment that Isolde had never once seen cross her face in 11 months of working beside her over a paring knife. Several of the former housemaids who had been dismissed under Augusta's reign, Polly among them, restored now to a position and a character besides, had come back for the afternoon, and the stories that passed around the long table were not the stories of triumph one might expect, but smaller, stranger ones. The time Augusta had made a girl repolish the same silver tray 3 times over an imagined fingerprint, the wages docked for a torn apron that had, in fact, been torn before the girl was ever hired. "I remember thinking we were nothing to them," said one of the older footmen, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "Turns out we were rather more trouble to replace than they ever let on." The room laughed at that, not unkindly, and Isolde, listening from the end of the table, understood that what she was witnessing was not really a celebration of her own restoration at all. It was something quieter and, in its way, more important, a household full of people relearning, slowly and out loud, that their own memories of the past 6 years had been true the entire time, and had simply lacked, until now, anyone willing to say so in a room where it mattered. Of Cedric and Augusta Ravensworth, little more was heard in London society beyond the occasional, increasingly distant rumour, a sighting in a hotel dining room in Brussels, a debt left unpaid at a gaming table in Baden, the kind of fragmentary gossip that follows people who have spent their whole lives mattering and discovered, finally, that they no longer do. Isolde did not inquire after them further. She had judged them once, in a ballroom before 200 witnesses, and found that a single clear judgment, properly delivered, required no repetition to remain true. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once it stops needing to perform for anyone, and Isolde found, in the months that followed, that she had grown to prefer it to every chandelier-lit room she had ever stood in carrying someone else's tray. She kept, in a small drawer of her writing desk, the plain grey gown she had worn for 11 months, mended at the elbows, the cap still creased from where it had pinned her hair into someone else's shape, and though she never again had occasion to wear either one, she found she could not quite bring herself to give them away. They had taught her something the silk and the title never could have, on their own. She thought often, in those quiet hours, of the 11 months she had spent answering to a name that was not hers, and she understood, with the clarity of distance, that those months had taught her something no schoolroom ever could have, that the people who reveal the most about their character are rarely watching the people they believe beneath their notice, and that the watching itself, patient and unglamorous as it was, had been its own kind of inheritance. A title can be stolen for a season, a signature can be forged, a will destroyed, a name struck from a parish register if the right hands are bribed and the right silence is bought. But the small, daily choice of whether to treat a stranger with cruelty or with decency, made 100 times a day by people who believe no one of consequence is watching, that Isolde had come to understand, cannot be inherited, cannot be purchased, and cannot, in the end, be faked indefinitely. If this story moved you, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What did you take from Lady Isolde's journey, and what would you have done in her place? Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story. This story is entirely fictional and created with the assistance of AI for entertainment purposes only. It is set against a Victorian-era backdrop for dramatic effect and does not claim historical accuracy in every detail. It does not refer to, represent, or target any real individual, family, title, or estate, living or deceased. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.